Okay, now we get to the part of the lecture where we start the lecture part. So this lecture is about state and local interaction, how the states interact with their local government. We're going to start with the idea of where does power come from? There have been many sources of power historically. The one we're most common we know most is the whole idea of the divine right, that a king has the right to rule because of some kind of divine ordination. Of course, the United States was not formed on that idea. We were formed on the idea of the social contract. And the social contract is most formally connected with our constitutions. So the US national government then gets its power and its authority to govern from the US Constitution and the various treaties that it enters into. Similarly, the U.S. state governments get their power both from the U.S. Constitution, the 10th Amendment, and all of that, and from their own constitutions. And we call this federalism. Local governments, on the other hand, get their power from the state. So the federal government could not eliminate the state of California. The state of California could eliminate the city of Fullerton. And so it's really important to understand that there's this tension because all of the local municipal governments ultimately get their power from the states. This can create some tension because the localities are in a subservient relationship vis-a-vis the state, whereas the state really isn't in a subservient relationship to the federal government. From this, there is a concept called Dillon's Rule that says the powers of local government are limited to those expressly granted by the state or those powers closely linked to those express powers. So the powers of local government kind of are entirely dependent on what the state allows them to do. There are things that the localities not just can do, but have to do, and these are called mandates. Mandates are laws that require states and their localities to do specific things. Federal mandates can come in a variety of forms. They can be non-revenue, meaning it costs no money to implement them. There can be various incentives in order to do specific actions. There are some mandates that are funded, and this means that the federal government provides the money to the states and localities to implement the program. And there are also unfunded mandates that the federal government requires states and localities to do something, but doesn't provide the money for that. There's kind of an intermediate stage between funded and unfunded mandates, a partially funded or a mostly funded mandate as well. Some examples of unfunded mandates are the Americans with Disabilities Act and Medicaid. So when the U.S. passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, one of the requirements was that all public buildings be accessible to people with disabilities. For example, a public courthouse would have to have a ramp allowing somebody in a wheelchair to access the building. The Americans with Disabilities Act mandated this, but the federal government did not provide funds to build these ramps and other kinds of access points. And so this would be an unfunded mandate. Medicaid is a partially funded mandate. The federal government gives the states money to pay for Medicaid, but not enough to pay for everything that is required by receiving the money. And so that's kind of a partially funded mandate. States too have mandates that they put on their localities. They can do this in terms of law. They can, and just like the federal government, they can do incentives and incentives, funded mandates and unfunded mandates. So, for instance, a recent discussion that we've been having here in California is how much low-income housing are localities required to provide. The cities are pushing back on increased low-income housing, saying that this is going to cost them money. That it's going to cost them tax revenue. It's going to cost them money to implement these programs, and they want to. And they're pushing back, saying this is an unfunded mandate. Another kind of mandate that happens at the state level, and it happens far more often at the state level than it does at the federal level, are various forms of policy mandates. The the state requires the locality to put into place some sort of policy that doesn't necessarily cost them money, but creates a controversy. For instance, in California, we have declared ourselves a sanctuary state and done a lot of pushback on any of our localities that say that they are not a sanctuary place. Whereas, like in Texas, they formally declared themselves not a sanctuary state and required their localities to not declare themselves sanctuary cities. Another example of this is the so-called bathroom bills. In many states, the state government declared that no locality could create laws that would protect transgender people in terms of their access to restrooms. And so there's a lot of pushback on this. It didn't cost the cities any money to implement the policy, but there was a political cost to it. Another kind of example of this is educational standards. For instance, the in California, we have a requirement to use Common Core. The There may be some costs affiliated with getting the textbooks and stuff like that, but it's mainly a policy mandate. Maybe a better example of an education mandate is how the localities implement sex ed. So in California, we have said that sex ed needs to start in some form in kindergarten, where other states mandate that it not start until junior high or high school. Similarly, the type of sex ed that's delivered can vary from state to state, and may or may not be decided at the state level. So some states have decided that all of their localities, all of their school districts have to teach abstinence only sex ed, whereas even if a local school district would want to teach a different type of sex ed, they'd be prohibited from doing that by state law. That is a policy mandate. It doesn't really cost you any money to do one form of sex ed over another, but it can generate a lot of controversy.